The air at the Henderson Farm auction hung thick and heavy, a gritty cocktail of diesel fumes, cheap cigar smoke, and the fine, powdery dust of a dry August. It was 1972. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Slim Perkins, whose voice could cut through the roar of a tractor pull, was working the crowd like a preacher at a revival. Men in seed corn caps and sweat-stained work shirts stood with their arms crossed, faces hardened by the sun, occasionally lifting a finger or giving a sharp nod to signal a bid. Their wives sat in folding chairs under the shade of a massive oak, fanning themselves with sale bills and trading gossip in low murmurs. I was standing near the back, leaning against the rusty fender of my old Ford F-250, just watching. I wasn't there to buy, not really. I was there to see what the market was doing, to gauge the mood of the county. And the mood was electric. Grain prices were climbing faster than a cat up a screen door, and you could feel the optimism, the ambition, radiating off the crowd. It was a dangerous feeling. Frank Blevins was holding court near the auctioneer's truck. He'd just bought a brand-new John Deere 4430, trading in a 4020 that was barely 3 years old. He stood there, thumbs hooked in his brand-new overalls, a wide grin splitting his face. The banker, Mr. Abernathy, was standing right beside him, clapping him on the back. Frank was the poster boy for the new way of farming: borrow big, buy bigger, and let the good times roll. His farm, which bordered mine to the west, was a showcase of the latest and greatest. Gleaming green and yellow paint, air-conditioned cabs, and a debt load that would have given my father a heart attack. My operation was the polar opposite. The Miller farm ran on old iron and elbow grease. My main tractor was a 1951 Farmall M my dad had bought new. My planter was a John Deere 494 that had seen more seasons than I had. Nothing was shiny, everything was paid for. That was the first and last lesson my father ever taught me about money. If you can't write a check for it, son, you can't afford it. The bank ain't your partner. It's a wolf you invite into the henhouse. He'd lived through the 30s, and the fear of debt was branded onto his soul. He'd passed that brand to me. Slim Perkins moved on from the household goods and the smaller implements, his voice rising in pitch as they got to the heavy equipment. "All right, boys, let's get serious. Next up, we got a real piece of history for ya." Two of the auction hands motioned toward the far end of the equipment line. Tucked behind a worn-out New Holland haybine was a hulking, rusted beast. It was a Caterpillar D6 bulldozer, an old one from the 50s, maybe earlier. It sat listing to one side, its tracks half sunk into the soft earth. The blade was scarred and bent, the engine cowling was dented in, and a thick coat of orange rust covered every exposed surface. A greasy, dark stain ran down the side of the engine block, telling a story of a catastrophic failure. It hadn't moved under its own power in a decade or more. It was 10 tons of dead, forgotten iron. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. Frank Blevins guffawed, turning to his buddies. "Look at that thing. Henderson should have just called the scrapyard." "What'll you give me for this classic piece of American steel?" Slim chanted, trying to work up some enthusiasm. "Who'll start the bidding at $500? $500 to get it going. It's worth that in scrap, boys." Silence. The only sound was the wind rustling the dry corn leaves in the field next to us. "Come on now, don't be shy. 400? Give me 400 for this yard ornament." More silence. Slim was starting to sweat. He looked around, his eyes pleading. "All right, $100. Who'll give me $100 to haul it away?" That's when I raised my hand. A low murmur went through the crowd. Heads turned. I could feel their eyes on me, a mixture of pity and amusement. Frank Blevins pointed a thick finger in my direction, a look of pure disbelief on his face. "Miller? What in the hell do you want with that hunk of junk?" Slim's eyes lit up. "I got 100 from Jack Miller. $100. Now who'll give 150? 150. Another man, a scrapper from the next town over, lifted a finger. 150. I got 150, now 200. I nodded. 200. 250. The scrapper shot back. I held up 3 fingers. 300. The scrapper squinted at the dozer, then at me. He was doing the math in his head. The cost to hire a lowboy trailer, the time to cut it up, the current price of scrap steel. He shook his head and waved his hand, backing out. 300 go in once, Slim yelled, his voice triumphant. Go in twice. Sold for $300 to Jack Miller. The gavel cracked like a rifle shot in the quiet afternoon. A wave of snickers and head-shaking followed. I ignored it, walking up to the clerk's table to pay my bill. As I counted out the $15, $20 bills, Frank Blevins sauntered over, his shadow falling across the table. "You finally lost your mind, Miller," he said, not unkindly, but with the condescending tone of a man who thinks he's doing you a favor by pointing out your foolishness. "That thing's got a thrown rod, at least. The undercarriage is shot. You'll spend $5,000 just to make it move. And for what? You could have put a down payment on a new case backhoe for that." I folded my receipt and tucked it into my shirt pocket. "It's my $300, Frank." "Yeah, and it's your funeral," he chuckled, turning to walk away. "Don't come crying to me when you can't get that thing to start." I just watched him go, rejoining his circle of admirers. They were the future, they thought. I was the past, a relic clinging to outdated ideas. But as I looked over at that 10-ton lump of rust, I didn't see junk. I saw potential. I saw the back 40 acres of my farm, a tangled mess of woods and swamp that my father had always called unfarmable. I saw a way to grow my operation, to add productive land, without signing my life away to Mr. Abernathy and his variable interest rates. I saw a challenge. Now, before I tell you how I got that 10-ton beast home and what it took to bring it back from the dead, I want to ask you something. Have you ever bought something everyone else called junk, knowing deep in your gut you could make it sing again? Let me know down in the comments what it was. A car, a tool, a piece of equipment. I'd love to hear your story. Because every farmer, every mechanic, every man who works with his hands has a story about a piece of scrap they brought back to life. This one is mine. Getting the D6 home was the first battle. It was one thing to buy it, another thing entirely to move a 10-ton paperweight. I called up old man Hemlock, who ran the only lowboy service in the county. His price was steep, but I didn't have a choice. He showed up the next morning, his ancient Mack truck belching black smoke, the long, flat trailer groaning behind it. He took one look at the dozer sunk in the dirt and let out a low whistle. "She's a big girl, ain't she, Jack? And she looks heavier than a dead preacher." The first problem was the auction yard was soft ground. The second was that the dozer's brakes were likely seized, its steering clutches frozen. We couldn't just pull it, we had to lift and drag. Hemlock had a big winch on the front of his truck, but the cable wasn't long enough to reach the dozer from the solid ground of the laneway. My solution was in the bed of my Ford, 100 feet of 3/4-inch logging chain and a couple of heavy-duty snatch blocks. It was slow, brutal work. We'd hook a snatch block to a big oak tree, run the winch cable through it, and hook the chain to the dozer's drawbar. The Mack's diesel engine would scream, the winch would whine under the strain, and the dozer would move grudgingly 6 inches at a time. It fought us every step of the way, digging new ruts in the yard, groaning like an old man getting out of a chair. Frank Blevins drove by in his shiny new pickup, slowing down just long enough to watch us struggle in the mud and grease. He didn't offer to help. He just shook his head with that pitying smile and drove on. It took us 4 hours of sweat and swearing just to get the machine onto the lowboy. By the time we had it chained down, my knuckles were bloody and my back felt like it was on fire. When we finally rolled into my farmstead, my wife, Sarah, came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the giant rusty machine dominating our yard and then looked at me, her face a mixture of concern and faith. She didn't say a word against it. She knew my father's ways were my ways, and she trusted me. That trust was worth more than all the money in Abernathy's bank. The dozer sat by the barn for the rest of the summer and fall, a monument to what the rest of the county called Miller's Folly. People I'd known my whole life would drive past, their pickups slowing down as they gawked. The jokes at the co-op feed store got louder. Heard Jack Miller's starting a museum for retired farm equipment. Nah, he's planting it. Hopes a new one'll sprout by spring. I ignored them. I had corn to harvest. I put in the crop with my old Farmall M, its 4-cylinder engine popping and sputtering rhythmically. It was slow going. Frank, with his new 4430 and 6-row planter, could do in a day what took me the better part of a week. He'd be done, sitting on his porch drinking a beer while I was still out there after dark. my tractor's single headlight cutting a lonely path through the dusty field. But at the end of the day, my crop was in, and I didn't owe the bank a dime for the privilege of planting it. Winter came early that year, a hard freeze in late November that locked the ground solid. The field work was done. For Frank Blevins, that meant a trip to Florida. For me, it meant it was time to go to work on the Caterpillar. I dragged it into my machine shed, a big pole barn my dad and I had built with our own hands. The space was dominated by the silent, cold mass of the Dozer. The first job was to diagnose the engine. The story at the auction was a throne rod, but that was just gossip. I needed facts. The engine was a D318, a big, slow-turning inline-six diesel known for being tough as nails. But even the toughest nails can bend. I put a 6-foot breaker bar on the crankshaft nut at the front of the engine. I put all my weight on it, my boots slipping on the greasy concrete floor. Nothing. It was seized up tighter than a drum. That was a bad sign. So began the teardown. Everything on that machine was built on a scale I'd never dealt with before. The bolts holding the cylinder head on were 1.5 inches thick. I had to heat them with an acetylene torch until they glowed cherry red, then beat on a massive wrench with a 10-pound sledgehammer just to break them loose. Each one came out with a groan of protesting metal. It took me 2 days to get the head off. I had to use a chain hoist rigged to a barn rafter to lift it. It must have weighed 400 pounds. When I finally swung it clear and looked down into the cylinders, I saw the problem. The number 4 cylinder was a disaster. The piston was shattered, and the cylinder wall was deeply scored with jagged gouges. A valve head had broken off and bounced around in there like a pinball, destroying everything it touched. Frank's buddies had been right about the diagnosis, if not the cause. It wasn't a thrown rod, it was a dropped valve. The engine was junk, or at least this block was. My heart sank. A new engine block, even if I could find one, would cost thousands. More than the Dozer was worth, more than I had. For a full day, I just stood there looking at the carnage inside that engine, the cold reality of my $300 mistake settling in. The voices of the town echoed in my head. Junkyard Jack lost his mind. I went into the house that night, covered in grease and despair. Sarah took one look at my face and knew. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just poured me a cup of hot coffee and sat with me at the kitchen table in silence. "The block is ruined," I finally said, my voice hoarse. "It's scrap iron after all." She reached across the table and put her hand on mine. "You'll figure it out, Jack," she said softly. "You always do." Her faith was a fire in the cold. The next morning I started making calls, not to the fancy dealerships, but to every tractor salvage yard in a 3-state radius. I spent days on the phone describing the D318 engine, asking if they had a parts machine, a forgotten block sitting in a corner. Most of them laughed, but finally a crusty old fella down in Missouri said, "Yeah, I might have something. Got an old D6 that burned up in a barn fire 20 years ago. Engine might be all right if the fire wasn't too hot. You'd have to come see for yourself." The next day I hitched up my flatbed trailer and started the 6-hour drive south. The salvage yard was a graveyard of rusting farm equipment, acres and acres of it. The old man led me to the back, to the burned-out shell of the D6. It was a sorry sight, but when we pulled the dipstick, the oil was still clean. The fire had cooked the outside, but hadn't gotten hot enough to warp the block. I paid him $200 for the engine, and another $100 for him to pull it out with his crane. The next 3 months were a blur of cold steel, busted knuckles, and the constant smell of penetrating oil. I tore down the salvage yard engine completely, checking every bearing, every seal, every piston ring. I used the best parts from both engines to build one good one. I honed the cylinders myself, mic'd the crankshaft, plaster-gauged the bearings. I sat in the cold shed with the thick, greasy parts manual spread open on a workbench, studying the diagrams until my eyes burned. It was slow, painstaking work. While the rest of the county was watching television, I was timing injector pumps and torquing head bolts. By early March, just as the frost was starting to leave the ground, it was ready. I'd reassembled the entire engine and wrestled it back into the Dozer's frame. I filled it with fresh oil and diesel fuel. I bled the fuel lines, my hands trembling slightly with a mix of cold and anticipation. This was the moment of truth. I climbed up into the operator's seat. There was no fancy key start. This old beast had a small gasoline pony motor that you had to hand crank to life, which in turn would spin the big diesel. I got the pony motor sputtering, and after a few minutes it was running smoothly. I engaged the clutch to the main engine. The big diesel began to turn, slowly at first. Whoosh, chuff, whoosh, chuff. I opened the compression release, letting it spin faster to build up oil pressure. Then I closed the release and gave it full throttle. The engine caught. It was not a gentle awakening. It was a violent, earth-shaking explosion. A huge cloud of black smoke erupted from the short, straight exhaust pipe, billowing up to the rafters of the shed. The whole machine shuddered, and the concrete floor beneath me vibrated. The sound was deafening, a deep, throaty, hammering roar that was more felt than heard. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. I let it run for a minute, my hands on the controls, feeling the raw power thrumming through the steel. I eased the main clutch forward. The old dozer lurched, the tracks clanked, and for the first time in more than a decade, it moved under its own power, crawling out of the machine shed and into the pale March sunlight. I had done it. I had taken a pile of scrap and breathed life back into it. The grain boom of the early 70s was in full swing. In 73, the Russians bought millions of bushels of American wheat, and commodity prices shot to the moon. Land that had been selling for $500 an acre was suddenly going for $1,500, then $2,000. The bankers, who just a few years before had been tight-fisted and cautious, were now practically throwing money at farmers. The mantra from the universities and the farm magazines was "get big or get out," and nobody was getting bigger, faster than Frank Blevins. He bought the 80 acres to the north of his place, paying a price that made all the old-timers shake their heads. He traded in his 4430 for a brand-new International Harvester 1066, complete with a factory cab, air conditioning, and a radio. He bought a new Gleaner combine, the biggest one they made. His farmstead looked like a dealership lot. Every time you saw him, he was in a new pickup truck, wearing a clean shirt. He was the picture of success, the embodiment of the new agricultural prosperity. He and his friends still looked at my operation and laughed. I was still running the old Farmall M. My combine was a Massey Ferguson 300, a self-propelled model from the late 50s that I'd bought for cash and rebuilt myself. And then there was the dozer. After I got the engine running, I spent the spring working on the undercarriage. I learned how to use a torch and an air arc gouger to cut out the old worn pins and bushings in the tracks. A filthy, dangerous job that sent showers of molten steel across the floor. I pressed in new ones with a 50-ton hydraulic press I'd bought at another auction. By the time planting season was over, the D6 was no longer a liability. It was a tool. I took it to my back 40, that piece of ground everyone had written off. It was a jungle of scrub oak, buckthorn, and swampland. For the entire summer of 1974, while Frank was farming an ever-expanding empire of rented and newly purchased ground, I was at war with that wilderness. The roar of the D6 became the soundtrack of my days. I'd start it up at sunrise and often wouldn't shut it down until after sunset. The work was brutal. I'd push over trees, the old cat groaning but never quitting. I'd shove the tangled root balls into massive piles to be burned later. The dozer's blade would hit hidden boulders that would send a shock through the whole machine, rattling my teeth. I learned to read the land, to feel through the controls what the blade was doing. I dug ditches to drain the swampy sections, laying thousands of feet of clay tile by hand. Slowly, painstakingly, acre by acre, I was carving a new field out of the wilderness. The rest of the county saw Frank Blevins as the smart one. He was adding hundreds of acres to his operation. I was just playing in the dirt with an old piece of junk. What they didn't see was that Frank was paying top dollar for his new acres, borrowing at interest rates that were starting to creep up. I was creating my new acres for the cost of fuel, oil, and my own sweat. My 40 acres wouldn't show up on the county plat map as new land, but they were new to me, and they were mine, free and clear. By the fall of 1975, I had cleared, leveled, and tiled 35 new acres of rich black topsoil. My first corn crop on that ground was one of the best I'd ever had. I was making money. Not Frank Blevin's money, but good, steady money. I paid my bills, put a little away for a rainy day, and slowly upgraded my equipment, always paying cash for good. Used machines I could fix myself. I bought a slightly newer John Deere 7700 combine, a big step up from the old Massey. I found a well-maintained International 806 tractor to help the old Farmall M. My fleet was still a patchwork of red, green, and yellow, but it was solid, and it was all mine. Frank, on the other hand, was leveraged to the hilt. He had to have a bumper crop every single year just to make his payments. He was farming fence row to fence row, pushing the land and his new equipment to the absolute limit. There was a frantic energy about him, a desperation behind the confident smile. I remember one afternoon I was at the bank, making a deposit. Mr. Abernathy, the loan officer, called me into his office. He had that slick, practiced smile on his face. "Jack," he said, leaning back in his big leather chair, "I've been watching you. You're a hard worker, but you're thinking too small. Prices are high, land is available. It's time to expand. Frank Blevin's just picked up another 160 acres. We can put together a package for you, get you into a new tractor, a bigger planter. You could be farming 1,000 acres in 5 years. He pushed a pile of papers across the desk toward me. Loan applications. I looked at them, then back at him. "And what's the interest rate on this package, Mr. Abernathy?" "Well, it's a variable rate," he said breezily, "tied to the prime. It's sitting at about 7% right now. A real bargain." A variable rate. The word sent a chill down my spine. It was a phrase my father had taught me to fear. "What happens when the prime rate goes up?" I asked. Abernathy waved his hand dismissively. "Don't you worry about that. The economy is booming. These good times are here to stay." I stood up and pushed the papers back across his desk. "No thank you, Mr. Abernathy. I'll stick to my own program." He looked at me with the same pity I saw in Frank's eyes. The look of a man who thinks he's talking to a fool who just doesn't understand the modern world. As I walked out of the bank, I felt a knot of unease in my stomach. Everyone thought these prices, this prosperity, would last forever. But I'd read a small article in the Farm Journal about inflation, about a man named Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve who was talking about tightening the money supply. Out on the street, the sun was shining, farmers were driving new trucks, and the grain elevator was doing brisk business. But it felt like the air before a storm, a heavy electric stillness that promised lightning was on its way. The storm broke in the winter of 1980. It didn't come with thunder and lightning, but with a quiet announcement on the evening news. President Carter was embargoing grain sales to the Soviet Union. I was sitting in my armchair, tired after a long day of splitting firewood, and the words hit me like a physical blow. The Russians had been buying up our surplus for years, propping up the prices that had fueled the boom. Without them, the market would be flooded. By spring, the price of corn had fallen off a cliff. What was fetching nearly $4 a bushel the year before was now struggling to get $2. A knot of dread formed in the pit of my stomach, a cold, familiar feeling I remembered from my father's stories of the 30s. For me, it meant a tighter belt. For men like Frank Blevin's, it meant a catastrophe. His entire operation was built on the assumption of $4 corn. His loan payments to Mr. Abernathy were calculated on that rosy number. Then the sky turned against us. A dry spring gave way to a blistering summer. The rain simply stopped. Day after day, a merciless sun beat down from a hazy white sky. The corn in the fields, which should have been shoulder-high and dark green by July, was stunted and pale, the leaves rolling up tight like cigars to conserve what little moisture they had. The ground cracked open in patterns that looked like broken pottery. You could feel the heat shimmering off the blacktop roads, and the air was thick with the smell of dust and dying crops. The drought was hard on everyone, but it was hardest on the men who were farming the most land. Frank was running himself ragged, trying to keep his massive fleet of equipment going, trying to coax a crop out of the parched earth. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a permanent squint and a grim set to his jaw. I'd see his lights on late into the night, the big international tractor crawling across a field, kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the still air like ghosts. The new, complex machinery began to show its own cracks under the strain. One afternoon in late August, as I was tinkering with the sickle bar on my old haybine, I saw Frank's new Gleaner combine stop dead in the middle of his soybean field. He was trying to get the beans off early before they shattered in their pods from the dryness. An hour later, the dealership service truck pulled in. I watched through my binoculars as the mechanic in his clean uniform spent 2 hours looking at it before shaking his head. I saw Frank at the co-op the next day. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. "Hydrostatic pump," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Whole transmission is shot. Dealer wants $12,000 to replace it, and the part is on back order for 2 weeks." He kicked at a loose piece of gravel. 2 weeks. The beans will be on the ground by then. Every penny of profit gone. A few weeks later, it was his big International 1066. The turbocharger blew, sending a plume of blue smoke into the sky. Another expensive specialized repair, another week of downtime right in the heart of a difficult harvest. His state-of-the-art farm, the one everyone envied, was being paralyzed by failures he couldn't fix himself. The machines were too complicated, the parts too specialized. He was completely at the mercy of the dealership's schedule and the manufacturer's supply chain. My harvest was slow, the yields were poor, but my machines kept running. The old John Deere 7700 combine was simple enough that I knew every belt, every bearing by heart. When a drive chain snapped, I had a spare in my shop and was running again in an hour. The old Farmall M and the International 806 didn't have turbochargers to blow or computers to fail. They just ran, day in and day out, sipping fuel instead of guzzling it. The first real sign of Frank's crumbling empire came in the form of a "for sale" sign at the end of his lane. He was selling off 20 acres of woodland, a piece that wasn't tillable. He was trying to raise cash, but nobody was buying. Everyone was trying to sell. The optimism of the 70s had curdled into the fear of the 80s. The only people with cash were the ones who hadn't borrowed it in the first place, and there weren't many of us left. I saw him arguing with Mr. Abernathy on the sidewalk in front of the bank. There was no friendly back-patting now. Frank's face was red, his hands gesturing wildly. Abernathy stood there, unmoved, his arms crossed, his face a cold, impartial mask. The wolf was no longer pretending to be a partner. It was showing its teeth. The final hammer blow came from the Federal Reserve. To fight the runaway inflation that had plagued the country, the chairman, Paul Volcker, jacked up interest rates. The prime rate, the number that Mr. Abernathy had so breezily dismissed, began a relentless climb. 7% became 10. 10 became 15. Before it was over, it peaked at over 20%. For anyone with a variable rate loan, it was a death sentence. It was financial poison. Frank Blevins's loan payments didn't just go up, they exploded. The amount of money he owed the bank every month tripled. With crop prices in the gutter and a drought-ravaged yield, there was no earthly way he could make it. He was trapped. The auction notices started appearing in the paper like obituaries. First, it was the younger guys, the ones who had just gotten started and borrowed heavily. Then it was established names, families who had been on their land for generations. Every Saturday, another farm went under the hammer. The mood at these sales was the complete opposite of that day at the Henderson auction. There was no optimism, no ambition. The air was thick with failure and despair. Men stood in silence, their shoulders slumped, watching as their neighbors' lives were sold off, piece by piece, wondering if their own farm would be next. Frank held on through the winter of 81, but by the spring of 82, it was over. The notice for the Blevins auction ran on the front page of the county paper. Total liquidation, land, equipment, tools, household goods, everything. The bank was taking it all. The day of the sale was cold and grey, a fitting sky for a funeral. The whole county was there, but nobody was smiling. The rows of gleaming equipment, the massive 1066, the broken Gleaner combine, the fleet of brand-new wagons, looked like monuments in a graveyard. Frank stood off to the side with his wife, his face ashen. He looked 10 years older than he had a year ago. He had done everything the experts had told him to do. He had modernized. He had expanded. He had been aggressive. And it had all led to this. I stood near the back, just as I had years before, leaning against the fender of my old Ford. But this time, I wasn't there to watch the market. I was there to bear witness. The auctioneer's voice was more subdued than Slim Perkins's had been, as if he knew he was presiding over a tragedy. The bidding was slow, pathetic. The big, expensive machines sold for a fraction of what Frank had paid for them. The bank was buying most of it back itself, just to cut its losses. There were no winners here. My own farm had survived. It wasn't easy. The low prices and the drought hurt me too. I had to watch every penny. Sarah and I planted a bigger garden, canned more vegetables. We did without. But we survived. My lack of debt was a fortress. The 20% interest rates that were destroying my neighbors meant nothing to me. My land was mine. My equipment was mine. When the bank statements came, they showed a modest balance, not a terrifying debt. My father's lessons, the ones that had made me an object of ridicule for a decade, had been my salvation. During that brutal harvest, the one that broke Frank, my old dozer had proved its worth in a new way. A flash flood had washed out a creek crossing that connected my neighbor, Old Man Peterson, to the main road. He was cut off. The county said it would be weeks before they could get a crew out to fix it. I fired up the D6. In one long day of roaring diesel and churning mud, I pushed tons of rock and earth, rebuilding the crossing, packing it solid. The machine that everyone had called junk was now a tool of survival, not just for me, but for my community. It represented a different kind of wealth, not the kind you find on a balance sheet, but the kind you find in self-reliance. The auctioneer moved from the equipment to the land itself. Frank's empire was being carved up and sold to the highest bidder. A parcel here to an out-of-state investor. A parcel there to a corporate farm from the next county. They were vultures picking at the bones. Finally, they came to the last piece, the home 80 acres. The original Blevins homestead where Frank's grandfather had built the barn that still stood. This was the heart of it all. The bidding started. The man from the bank was there, along with a lawyer representing an investment group from the city. They traded bids back and forth, their voices crisp and emotionless. They weren't buying a farm, they were acquiring an asset. I looked over at Frank. A single tear was tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. He was watching his family's history being erased. 28,000, the lawyer said coolly. 28.5, countered the banker. The auctioneer looked around. I have 28.5. Do I hear 29? Silence. It seemed the investors were done. 28,500 going once. That's when I raised my hand. I have 29,000 from Jack Miller, the auctioneer announced, his voice filled with surprise. Every head in the crowd turned to look at me. The banker and the lawyer both glared in my direction, annoyed by this local farmer interfering with their business. 30,000, the lawyer snapped. 31, I said, my voice steady. We went back and forth. 32. 33. The numbers were climbing past what the land was worth in that depressed market, but I didn't care. I was using the cash I had painstakingly saved during the good years, the money I hadn't spent on shiny paint and air-conditioned cabs. This was about more than land. 35, I said. The lawyer conferred with his client on a cell phone, a new and rare sight back then. He shook his head. He was out. The banker looked at me, then at his notes. He had a limit, a number the bank was willing to go to. 35.5, he said, a final grudging bid. 36, I said immediately, without hesitation. The banker stared at me for a long moment. He shook his head and turned away. Going once, the auctioneer called out, his voice ringing across the silent crowd. Going twice, sold for $36,000 to Jack Miller. A quiet gasp went through the crowd, followed by a low murmur of approval. I hadn't just bought a piece of land, I had saved a piece of the community. After the auction was over and the crowd had drifted away, leaving the Blevins farm quiet and empty, I found Frank sitting on the steps of his porch, his head in his hands. I walked up and sat down beside him. We sat in silence for a long time, watching the grey evening light settle over the fields. I don't know what to say, Jack, he finally mumbled, not looking at me. After all the times I laughed at you, your old tractors, that damn dozer. You weren't laughing alone, Frank, I said quietly. Why'd you do it? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. Why'd you buy the home place? To rub my nose in it? I shook my head. No, I did it because a man's home place shouldn't be owned by a bank or some faceless company in the city. It should be cared for. I pulled a piece of paper from my pocket. It was a simple rental agreement I had written out myself. I want you to stay, Frank. I want you to farm this 80. Rent it from me. The price is low, just enough to cover the taxes. You use my equipment if you need to. You get yourself back on your feet. He finally looked at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. You'd do that? I would, I said. And one more thing. This paper says that any time in the next 10 years, you have the option to buy this land back from me for exactly what I paid for it today. Not a penny more. He stared at the paper, then at me. The dam of his pride and grief finally broke. He buried his face in his hands and wept. Great shuddering sobs of a man who had lost everything and had just been handed an impossible sliver of hope. I put a hand on his shoulder and just sat there with him as the dusk settled around us. The years that followed were healing years. The farm crisis slowly receded. Prices stabilized, the rains returned, and the land began to breathe again. Frank Blevins never did buy the 80 acres back. He and his wife moved to town a few years later, where he got a job managing the co-op. He was good at it. He understood the numbers, and having seen the worst, he gave good, cautious advice to the young farmers who were just starting out. We became friends. A quiet, respectful friendship forged in the crucible of hard times. I eventually bought the rest of his original farm, paying him a fair price for the land the bank had seized and sold to me. My own farm grew, but it grew slowly, organically. I bought land when I could afford it, always with cash. My son David grew up and decided he wanted to farm with me. He had my father's hands and my quiet way of looking at the world. He understood the lessons before I even had to teach them. He saw the proof all around him, in the abandoned farmsteads and the resilient ones. One crisp autumn afternoon, years later, David and I were in the shop. He was a young man now, strong and capable. We were working on the old Caterpillar D6. The pony motor was getting hard to start, and we were rebuilding its carburetor. The Dozer was scarred and faded, its blade worn smooth from decades of work, but the big diesel engine was as strong as ever. You know, Dad, David said, carefully cleaning a tiny brass jet with a piece of wire. Some of the guys I went to school with, they give me a hard time. They ask why we still run this old stuff, why we don't have a brand new four-wheel drive tractor with GPS. I stopped what I was doing and looked at the massive ancient machine that filled our shop. I thought back to that auction day, the laughter of the crowd, the pity in Frank Blevins's eyes. I thought of the long, cold winter I spent bringing its dead engine back to life. I thought of the 35 acres of rich black soil it had clawed from the wilderness for me. Land that had cost me nothing but sweat and fuel. I thought of how its simple, brute strength represented everything that had allowed us to survive when the modern world failed. Son, I said, my voice softer than I intended, this dozer, this farm, it's not about being the biggest or the fastest. It's about being solid. It's about building something on a foundation of rock, not sand. Debt is sand. It feels solid when times are good, but when the storm comes, it washes right out from under you. I pointed out the open shop door, across the yard to the fields that stretched to the horizon. Everything you see out there, we own. The land, the machines, the crops in the bin, it's ours. The bank doesn't own it. The government doesn't own it. We do. That's a freedom most people don't understand anymore. This old dozer didn't just help us build a farm, it helped us build a life, a free one. David nodded slowly, a look of deep understanding in his eyes. He finished with the carburetor, and together we bolted it back onto the pony motor. He pulled the crank rope, and after a few sputters, the little engine coughed to life. A few minutes later, I climbed into the old steel seat and engaged the main engine. With a volcanic eruption of smoke and a deafening roar that shook the building, the heart of the old beast hammered into life once more. It was a sound of defiance, of resilience, of victory. It was the sound of our survival.